Catherine O'Flaherty Farris, better known as Kate Chopin, was an American author of short stories and novels. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri on February 8, 1850. Her most outstanding works are The Awakening and The Story of an Hour. Kate married Oscar Chopin, who was a member of St. Louis French Creole community. In their marriage, they had 5 sons and a daughter. Her father, Thomas O'Flaherty, was a wealthy businessman who died aboard a train. In 1880, Kate Chopin narrated short stories, articles, and translations that appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Criterion, Harper's Young People, the St. Louis Dispatch, and Vogue newspapers. Her novel The Awakening was criticized due to moral issues of the time. Kate Chopin died on August 22, 1904 in her hometown.
It is also important to note about the literary movement that characterizes the work of Kate Chopin. In this sense, the movement is realism, which developed between 1870 and 1910. Three of its main characteristics are transparent language, verisimilitude, and social critique. Then as for transparent language, one big innovation of realist literature was the use of simple, transparent language. For example, no realist novel is going to begin with some fancy shanty phrase. In the second place, verisimilitude. Realist literature is famous for the way it tries to create a world that seems real or true. Realist writers want you to believe that we are watching real life unfold on the page. And finally, social critique. Realist writers are all about critiquing the social and political conditions of the world that they write about.
During the life of Kate Chopin, there were two historic events in the United States: the reconstruction and construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Reconstruction was a political and social process by Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, in which amendments were made to the Constitution to attempt to correct the social inequalities resulting from slavery. Reconstruction also attempted the readmission of the Confederate States to the Union after the Civil War. The other historic event was Transcontinental Railroad. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was essential for the development of the American economy. On May 10, 1869, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. This historic event is known as the Golden Spike.
Point of view. Point of view refers to who tells the story and how it is told. In this short story, we have a third-person narrator. It is an outsider who uses and refers to the characters by their own names. For example, in the following quote: "It was her sister, Josephine, who told her, in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Her husband's friend, Richard, was there too, near her." The narrator is omniscient because it is all-knowing and takes the reader inside the character's thoughts, feelings, and motives, as well as shows what the characters say and do, as in this fragment. "She wept at once, with sudden, wild abandonment, in her sister's arms." The setting is the physical and social context in which the action of the story occurs. The story takes place in the light of 19th century at the Mallard residence. Some of the places in this house that it presents are Louis Mallard's room, the estates of the house, the window of the room, and some objects. For example, there stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. We can also identify the geographical location of the story, such as she could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees. Finally, we can say that the socioeconomic environment that surrounds the characters is characterized by the fact that it is mentioned the railroad and the newspaper office, as mentioned in the following quote. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received. Characters. On the one hand, we have the main characters. In this story, the protagonist is Lois Mallard. We can show that she is a dynamic character due to her changes in attitude, behavior, and purpose as the story progresses. Also, she is very well described as in the following quote. She was young, with a very calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. On the other hand, we have Brentley Mallard, who is also characterized by being a dynamic character, since he presents changes through a story. Second, as minor characters are Josephine, sister of Lois, and Brentley's friends Richards, who characterize themselves as static characters, since they don't change in the course of the story. For example, it was his sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Richards stood waiting for them at the bottom.
Regarding the plot, I will mention the parts that compose it and a brief quote from the story to exemplify. So, exposition. It is the one that provides the necessary background to give meaning to the action. We can see in knowing that Mrs. Meyer was afflicted with a hair trouble. Rising action. Rising action develops a series of complication or intensification of the conflict that lead to a crisis. For example, there was something coming to her and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? Climax. Climax is a moment of a greater tension that fixes the result, and in this story is her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch on her body. Falling action is when the action falls, and it is she did not stop to as if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. And finally, resolution is how the plot complications are resolved. They said she had died of her disease of the joy that kills. Continue with the conflict, we can say that the conflict is man versus himself. In this case, it is Mrs. Meyer versus herself. Why? Because she is torn between the pain caused by the death of her husband and the enormous happiness of starting to live for herself. We can argue it with a quote. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She didn't know. When she abandoned herself, a little whisper word escaped her sadly pale lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. With regard to irony, we can find two types. Verbal irony. That it makes a literary piece more effective by provoking readers into analyzing and thinking harder about a situation. Some examples are, and yet she had loved him, sometimes, often she had not. What it means? That despite loving her husband, she feels self-conscious about him. The second example is, she had died of her disease, of the joy that kills. And the meaning is, she dies after great happiness for feeling free from her husband. The second type of irony is situational irony. But the characters and the audience are fully unaware of the implications of the real situation. An example is, someone was opening the front door with a latch key. It was Brentley Meyer who entered. Neither the reader nor the characters knew that Mr. Meyer was alive.
The theme is submission and the loss of the freedom that marriage meant to women in the 19th century. Kate Chopin expressed the theme in this short story through the feelings and thoughts of Mrs. Mallard, who is the main character. On page 3, the omniscient narrator says, There will be no powerful will-bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon fellow creature. Here, the heavy burden of marriage on woman is described. As soon as women got married, they had to give up their own lives to live in order to tend to their husbands. There are many symbols in this story. However, the main symbols are the open window, the spring, and the descent of the stairs. On the first page, the narrator says, "There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. The open window represents the hope of peaceful future." Then, on the page 3, the narrator says, "Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring's days and summer's days, and all sorts of days that would be her own. Spring means a new beginning, a new life after crippling marriage." And finally, on the page 4, the narrator says, "She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descend the stairs." The descent of the stairs means the return to reality and the breaking of Mrs. Mallard's dreams of freedom. Throughout the story, the narrator repeatedly creates a suspenseful atmosphere to indicate that something will happen later. This happens even from the beginning of the story. On page 1 says, "Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gentle as possible the news of her husband's death." With this little clue, the reader imagines that something will going to happen to Mrs. Mallard's heart. Further on page 2, the narrator says, "There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it?" The final question indicates the presence of something unknown or that something is going to happen to Mrs. Mallard.
The structure that Chopin has chosen is made up of a series of short paragraphs, many of which consist of only 2 or 3 sentences, as in the following quote. "When the doctors came, they said she had died of her disease of the joy that kills." The short, dense structures reflects the intense hour Lois spends contemplating her newfound independence. So, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. Chopin makes each sentence important by employing an almost poetic style of writing. She uses repetition to highlight important points, such as when she repeats the words "open" through the story to emphasize the freedom of Lois' new life. She was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Finally, Chopin embellishes the prose of the story using alliteration and internal rhymes. For example, "She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms."
Figurative language. Simile. Simile is a figure of speech involving a comparison between two unlike entities. The example is, "She carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory." The explanation is, the protagonist compares herself to a queen of victory and uses the term like. Metaphor. It suggests some resemblance or make a connection between the two things. The example is, "When the storm of grief had spent itself." And the explanation is, a connection is made between immense pain and the force of a storm. And finally, personification. Personification is a subtype of metaphor where something inanimate or not human is capable of human action. Example is, "The delicious breath of rain was in the air." The explanation is, A wraith is a tribute to the rain. Final note, you can find more examples in the video.
Sensory language helps the reader through his or her sense to imagine the situation described by the narrator. The following are 3 examples of sensory language. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. This is an auditory imagery. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. This is a visual imagery. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. This is an olfactory imagery.